Did you know that for centuries, grape farmers and quality-conscious vignerons have been engaging in a practice called Massal selection, where said farmer will closely observe a vineyard or a group of vineyards and carefully, one by one, pick out a series of vines, each of which will have exhibited a particular quality trait or sensory trait or growth pattern that they find to be highly desirable for grape production and eventually for wine production. Now, once he's noted and selected the vines that he thinks show the best qualities, he will then begin to propagate these vines and produce new vines and plant new vineyards. And ideally, these new vineyards will exhibit all of the qualities that he has isolated from this group of vines. Now, the system has been mostly successful. And in fact, if it wasn't, it wouldn't have lasted as long as it has. But because this farmer or vigneron has chosen a whole bunch of vines, there's a much bigger genetic pool. And where you have a bigger genetic pool, there is also a greater chance that perhaps a rogue characteristic that might have been dormant for one generation will rear its ugly head and perhaps produce grapes that were not quite what the farmer had been hoping for. But then along came a process called clonal selection, which is where a farmer or a vigneron or a quality conscious lab technician will pick one particular vine and then will take cuttings from that vine and propagate a series of generations, watching this vine closely from generation to generation to ensure that there are no ugly genes that will pop up because they've just been dormant for one generation. Now, this process obviously takes a lot longer because you need to produce multiple generations of vines from this single parent, and things that take a long time also take a lot of money. But the advantage of clonal selection is that because everything comes from one single parent and it is observed for an extended period of time, the level of consistency from the offspring vines is far higher. So the ability to replicate those desired traits is far greater. Interestingly enough though, Massal selection has been making a comeback of late, especially amongst more progressive vignerons and grape farmers, because the wine fraternity has kind of rediscovered the truth that genetic variability is actually a good thing, not least of all in defense against total annihilation at the hands of one particular pest or one particular disease. Because if a particular genetic strain shows a weakness against a certain disease and the entire vineyard has the identical genetic makeup, the chances are that disease will wipe them all out. But we can talk about the strengths and weaknesses of clonal selection versus Massal selection on another day, because there really is too much to say for now. Of course, the reason that we're discussing clonal selection at all is because today's hand drink solo wine of the day is the Mother Rock Carbonic Maceration Pinot Noir, which is made by the rather exciting winemaker Johann Stompie Meyer. The wine is made using grapes that come from vines propagated from cuttings of the Dijon clone 115. We talked earlier about how clonal selection is different to Massal selection and how a vine clone is really just a very specific replication of the genes from one particular vine through generations. But having said that, one also needs to note that not all clones are equal. You will see around the world in certain regions that some clones have been elevated to the realms of celebrity clone. And while this does sound a little like an episode of the Black Mirror, what it actually is simply a case of the fact that some clones have been isolated from vines that grew in a region that has now become super trendy, or from vines that perhaps demonstrated or exhibited a set of characteristics that are particularly rare and particularly desirable. Now, Dijon clones were all named after the town of Dijon in Burgundy because all Dijon clones were in fact propagated from cuttings of Pinot Noir vines in the Burgundy region. As we know, Burgundy is the indisputable spiritual home of Pinot Noir and is also home to the world's most famous and most expensive Pinot Noirs. Now, we can talk about the detailed history and the story of the Dijon clones another time, but for now it suffices to say that these Dijon clone baddies have an unreal level of street cred. They're kind of like Adidas originals. Because sure, along the way there may have been more modern designs, there may have been technological advancements, but somehow the wine world still harks back to that original retro clone aesthetic. So even though these clones were isolated 70 or 80 years ago, they still seem to hold unrivaled authority and street cred in the area of vine clones. Not least of all because at least clones 114 and 115 were reproduced from cuttings that came from the famed vineyard of Clos de la Roche near the town of Moret-Saint-Denis. Who cares about genetic lineage, Han? We want to know that the wine tastes good in the glass. So when we finally get there and give it a sniff, well, we really do get aromas that give us two sides to the wine. This is mostly because of the way that the wine was fermented. We know that this is a 100% carbonic maceration fermentation wine because it says so on the label. That carbonic maceration will trigger a whole range of aromas like strawberry fruit pastilles, raspberry sherbet, cherry candy. But then the wine is still a Pinot Noir. And so you get the slightly more classic Pinot Noir notes, which include really lovely rose petals, then some kind of mysterious earthy potting soil, and even a level of fresh Mediterranean herbs. Now it's when we get to take a sip that we really start to appreciate the super light-footed nature of the wine. Again, this is largely coming down to the fact that it was a carbonic maceration fermentation, because almost by definition, in order to successfully ferment according to carbonic maceration, you have to treat the grapes really gently. And so it is that extraction is at a lower level and there's less pump overs, less phenolics are drawn out of those grape skins. But that said, this wine does not lack intensity. There's a whole bunch going on. We give it another sip. Well, there's crazy level of super delicious, intense sour cherry red fruit, fresh but ripe pomegranate, and then later towards the end, just when you think it's kind of winding up, you get this beautiful textured waxy blood orange. But as was the case with the aromas, it's not a one-sided affair because that carbonic maceration does bring out a slightly more playful element. So you get these strawberry fruit chew elements and more of that cherry candy that we spoke about. Finally, the wine is pretty young, so you do get a touch of those grippy tannins, which provides a nice little frame for all the other stuff. But really, the real stars of the show are the way that the bright red, juicy berry acidity leans up against the sweeter, more gentle, candied notes of the wine. And really, that dynamic is beautiful to behold. Okay, that's all we have time for today, but if you enjoyed the video, then support us on Patreon and subscribe to the HanDrinksSolo YouTube channel, where we publish at least 6 videos each month talking about things like wine science, wine history, unusual cultivars, and some of the rising winemaking stars that are coming out of the ever-changing South African winelands.